Hello everyone, once again another deck profile for set 6, this time on the updated Gandeeva deck evolving to Masques, because this is the one nation that never had a Masque unit along with Cater, and we finally got a Masque unit for both respective nations, and that being the decks that were introduced in the same set where Masques was introduced. So it's actually very fitting that they decided to put Gandeeva as a Masque unit, since Gandeeva was actually introduced along with Masques. And I have to say, it works. But anyway, how I think about the deck, it still plays very similar how when Kagero was played and how Gandeeva was first introduced. Basically, retire your opponent's rear guards, and the strong point is that if you fail, you do something as extra. Because one thing about Gandeeva that is unique to basically more Kagero-like decks is that you're binding your own stuff from the drop zone face down, and because you're binding them face down, your opponent cannot look at it. And that was a strong point about Gandeeva back in the day, especially on how easy it is. And the part where it gets even more power, like a ticking time bomb, over time. And even better if you fail, because if your opponent has no field, you get extra bonuses for failing. And that was one thing that I really like about Gandeeva besides its design, because I'm a sucker for dragons. But now with Masques, the deck is a little faster, but the main issue I did find when playing the deck is that it becomes more lacking as turns pass by, in comparison to original Gandeeva. Because original Gandeeva had like extra bonuses that you can still use in comparison to Masques, where it's restricted with the original Gandeeva basically. But anyway, with all that out of the way, let's just begin with the deck profile with, of course, the Ride deck. So first off, let's start off with the starter being Scarlet Flame. I'm only using this ride line just because it is part of the archetype, but I do see people using the Basaga ride line because you can actually just search your weapon and then filter out one card from the deck, but I prefer this one, just my opinion. So in which we go to the grade 1, where you can ride the grade 2 for free if your opponent has 1 or less rear guards, but if your opponent has 2 or more rear guards, when ridden upon, you call it to rear guard, which is not too bad. It just basically encourages your opponent to call, so it just depends on your opponent. Of course, usually you're going to be riding this for free, since usually your opponent has nothing to call at the early game. In which we go to the grade 2, where the grade 3 that you ride that is Gandeeva, the act skill is now free, which is very huge, especially for now this updated deck where Counterblast is a little bit more heavy than it used to be, but still not super heavy and fast enough for it to go out. In fact, Soul is now being used more. And now we go to Gandeeva itself. So Gandeeva, what used to make it strong is that each time when your opponent's rear guard is retired, you choose a card from your drop zone and bind it face down. This is linked to the next skill. For every card you have face down plus 5k and you have at least 5, crit plus 1. This was very easy back in the day because of certain other aspects, especially the extra crit. Like for the next skill, where act once per turn, Counterblast 1, which will be nullified by the grade 2 on the first grade 3 ride. So choose your opponent's rear guards with different grades, and it has to be one of each grade, and then look at top 5 cards, and for each matching grade, you retire one of your opponent's rear guards. But if you retire 1 or less, bind one of your cards in the drop zone and draw a card. So basically, if you do not mass retire, you get extra bonuses, aka more bind face down and draw a card. That one additional bind face down is very helpful, and this is what I mean that if you fail, you're going to be able to get extra bonuses. And this is the part where Gandeeva needs a bit of luck to basically do the extra retire, because you need to reveal the same card grades as the ones that you choose as your opponent's rear guards. So you choose a 0 to 3, right? Well, you have to reveal 0, 1, 2, 3 to retire the respective each grade. So you reveal 3, you retire 3, reveal 2, you retire with the grade 2. If you do not reveal that specific grade, that card still stays on the board. And that's why I mean that if you fail, you get some extra stuff, which isn't bad either. Especially since adding on top of the first skill, for each one that you retire, you get 1 additional bind. And considering that you can retire at least 4 units with this, yeah, that could be 4 binds, which will leave you to at least having 1 more for the extra crit. So yeah, by itself, it's already very strong. But the thing is, you're not really going to use this as your main grade 3 anymore, but you will be using the last skill on the first grade 3 ride, so you're going to combo it with Masques. In which you go to the ride deck itself, so 3 more Gandeevas because you want to play it with Masques. In which we go to the Gandeeva Masque itself. So of course it can only be run by its original identity, and just like the original Gandeeva, each time when one of your opponent's rear guards is retired, you bind a card from your draw zone face down, which actually can be an issue with this deck in Masque because you're losing 1 card with Mask of Hydrogram from the drop zone and putting it to Soul, but at the same time it's not really an issue because you can Soul Blast it back out. Also gets the plus 2k for every bind face down you have, but not the extra crit, which is very unfortunate, but the next skill will give it back attack a crit because you can remove its old identity and then it inherits the axe skill of the original Gandeeva without the costs. That's very huge because now what you can do is you go Gandeeva and then regular Gandeeva skill to basically wipe out your opponent's board, and then this card will inherit the original Gandeeva with the extra crit, which is actually much more helpful than you think because early game crit and sometimes you do not have the stuff in the bind zone, which will let you do another mass retire board, by the way, for free, and if you do fail, you just get more bind. That's basically the idea here. Ride the original Gandeeva, use its skill, and then you Superior Persona ride this, depending on which turn it is, and then you do this again, doing a double mass nuke with more binds. And that's what makes Gandeeva Mask a little strong, especially since it does have a little bit of an early game crit. Of course, not restricted with the 5 units part, but sometimes you will not be able to get the 5 cards in the bind zone, so this is just more guaranteed of a crit from the early game. But the last skill is that you can Soul Blast 1 as an act, and then choose one of your opponent's rear guards and retire, but if you fail, you draw a card, which is one more additional retire, and basically if your mass retire fails, you're just basically doing this as an additional retire if you need it. But the extra draw is also very nice, so it's also very good for that. The amount of stuff that you can do all in one turn with the mass retire and extra draw is just insane, although it does become lackluster like turns onwards if the game goes way too long. But it is awesome overall, but at the same time very boring for the fact that it basically does exactly the same thing as original Gandeeva, just with few tweaks. But still overall pretty cool. And then next, because we play Mask of Hydrogram, you do draw a lot. There is ways to get this to your hand immediately, so you don't really need to run 3 comparing to Sariron Mask where you have to really be at Mask. So I say 2 is enough. And then I run Peruvian, in which from deck it is treated as also a grade 1 and 2, not a grade 0 unfortunately, but because of Gandeeva's playstyle where you want to reveal from the top 5 for the specific grade, this being treated as a grade 1, 2, and 3 at the same time is just very helpful for the extra retire. You're not going to always get this, but it is actually very helpful for the retire. And the second skill is that when this card attacks, if your Vanguard's Gandeeva, bind a card from your hand, choose one of your opponent's rear guards, retire, but you fail, you draw a card, and one unit gets with 5k. Both skills are very helpful, extends your bind, but mainly for the top deck part, funny enough. And then we go to Striga. This would be a 4 of if it wasn't for the fact that it was hit, because it is a 1 of hit right now. And if your Vanguard's Gandeeva, you can Soul Blast 1, bind another rear guard face down, and then choose one of your opponent's rear guards and retire it. But if you fail, you draw a card and bind another card from your drop zone face down. This card was so good back in the day because what you can do is sometimes even mass call this and then just bind another rear guard and then retire one of your opponent's rear guards, which will trigger Gandeeva's skill for another bind. But if you fail at that, you still get another bind from the Soul Blast because the Soul Blast puts a card in the drop zone and you draw a card on top of it. This card was just so good back in the day for the extra extended bind that it was kind of insane. In fact, I would still run 4 of this if it's actually allowed. But at the same time, this deck does use a bit of soul now because of a specific grade 2. So it might be at most 2 of if I could actually do that, but this is still one of the best cards to play in Gandeeva, so I would say do run this. And now to the grade 2 lineup. So first off, we go to Drag Raider Alphagar. So when your Gandeeva attacks, you can counter blast 1, bind this card face down, increase another bind, look at top 5 cards of your deck to superior call 1 unit. Very helpful because it's basically just a multi-attack engine, and yes, you can use 2 of these in 1 turn. Just watch out for the counter blast. And there's no reason not to run 4 because it's just multi-attack. Especially because Gandeeva already gives your whole front row plus extra power, and this being another bind face down is even more power. And another card that is a maybe cut down to 3 but is still good at 4 at the same time is the Drag Raider Darham, because this one is that when placed on rearguard and if your Vanguard is at least a grade 3 Gandeeva or Eugene, yes, it's a combined one, you can Soul Blast 1, Energy Blast 3, and choose one of your opponent's rearguards and retire it. But if you fail, it gets this skill, and you also draw a card. At the end of the battle that your Vanguard attacked, choose one of your front row units and it gets to stand. Yes, you get a front row restand once if you fail. So yeah, here's once again, it punishes your opponent for not having much of a board. Although it doesn't do an extra bind, it does still fill up the drop zone with the 1 Soul Blast, and this is the card that actually will use most of the Soul Blasting, because there's really no way to regain soul in this deck other than through riding, of course. So I am debating whether to run this at 3 or not, but considering the deck doesn't really use energy and this is the only other card that really uses Soul Blast, it is still pretty good as a 4 of. And it also has a second skill because, as you can tell, it says stand one of your front row units. It's gonna have a boosting skill where if you play a normal order this turn, it gets the boost ability. Now that ability is not gonna be played as much as it used to be with Gandeeva, because as you can tell, you don't play Best Harvest in this deck anymore. You have Mask of Hydrogram, which in a way is kind of the same net value as Best Harvest, because you're going to be mass retiring anyway, and your mass retiring is basically going to fail a lot of times, which is going to just enable you to do more draws. So that last skill is not going to be as relevant other than maybe the first grade 3 ride turn, because you're going to play Mask of Hydrogram. But you mainly do it for the retire and the fail restand skill. And then finally for the last grade 2, the 2 Dragon Tree Wretch, the new one, because this one can let you search for Mask of Hydrogram directly from your deck with 3 energy, since the deck doesn't really use energy, and also lets you search for Gandeeva Mask directly from your deck, hence why I only run 2 copies of the Mask of Hydrogram, because you don't really need to actually have 3, or you don't need to rush into it as really fast in comparison to Sariron. So that's it for the grade 2 lineup. For the grade 1 lineup, first off, Gandeeva, where you can Soul Blast 1 on place while your Vanguard is Scarlet Flame. And yes, you can even use this on the grade 1 turn, and here once again does another Soul Blast. Look at top 7 cards of your deck to choose 1 card from among them and add to your hand. But if you choose a card, of course, you have to bind a card from your hand face down, which is just another extended bind. Fills up the drop zone from the Soul Blast, which is also very nice. And here's what I mean that the deck does use a bit of soul, because this card will also be using soul. Although you're not gonna exactly use this skill as often as I might thought, but it is just extra consistency if you need it. But it has a second skill where, in the back row rear guard, once per turn, when your front row unit stands, this card also stands, aka the one that is combined with Eugene and Gandeeva. So it's just basically a restanding booster, which is very nice, but I don't really use this card too often, so I do say you can technically cut this down to maybe 2 at the least, but it's still pretty good to run because it lets you search for key pieces. In fact, this is actually one of the reasons why I run less of the Dragon Tree Wretches and Hydrogram, because this one is just another consistency searcher, but this one is any card, which is also very nice. And then finally, this could be any grade 1 slot, honestly. Because at the back row, while your Vanguard attacks, that's Gandeeva, and you have at least 3 bind cards, you can bind this card for a counter charge. Like I said, the deck does use a bit of counterblast, so the counter charge can be helpful, but not that fast or use absurdly too much to the point where you absolutely need to see the counter charge all the time. But this one depends on you, and it is personal preferences if you want to run this or not. It does kind of fight space with the other grade 1 as well, which is another thing, because that one wants to be behind the rear guard columns, and this one also wants to be behind the rear guard columns, but it is here just in case if you need it. And then finally 4 PGs, because PGs. And then to the trigger lineup, OT, 8 crits, 3 draws, because I do find myself needing those pieces, and 4 heals, 2 being counters. And so that's it for this deck profile on my Gandeeva Mask deck. What do you guys think of it? What other cards would you recommend, and what other changes would you make? And honestly, this deck is still pretty good, and I still like Gandeeva. Just a little surprised that they actually brought back Mask units, because Mask is kind of done already, but I'm surprised that they give us a what-if scenario for Mask unit, and this also being the first Dragon Empire Mask unit, which is also pretty cool. And it's also very fitting because this was also introduced when Mask was first introduced. So I actually do find it very fitting that they chose Gandeeva here. And in my opinion, Gandeeva probably should have been one of the Mask users. I'm just saying. But other than that, there's really not much to say about this deck other than it's basically cool design, being Kagero-like, and plays very similar to Kagero with few twists. Mainly with the bind face down, which is a little mechanic I care than like, especially on the part where if you fail to retire, you can do more stuff. It's something I really like about Gandeeva, and with Mask, it just kind of gave me a reason to play Gandeeva again. But overall, the deck still kind of functions a bit of the same, faster in the early game, but a little more lackluster in the late game. Of course, late game might not really happen as much, but having that really super fast early game can actually be very devastating, especially on how much setup that you can do. But do be careful with your drop zone and your soul, because you will be using the soul pretty fast. And in the early game, sometimes you do struggle with the drop zone, because you do need drop zone stuff to be able to buy more stuff. But other than that, there's really not much to say, and see you all next time.